Eliza Battle was one of the finest, most palatial boats that sailed the Tombigbee and the Alabama rivers. Built in the early 1850s, and about 1858, in fact exactly 1858, in February, the Eliza Battle was planning a special trip down the Tombigbee River to Mobile to take its passengers to Mardi Gras. That wonderful celebration, the oldest Mardi Gras. New Orleans has the biggest, but Mobile has the oldest. And planters and their wives and families from miles around gathered in Columbus to get on board the Eliza Battle and go down to Mobile to take part in Mardi Gras. They came in carriages and they came on horseback, and servants carried trunks and valises and hat boxes and loaded them into the staterooms. And meanwhile, other servants were loading on bales of cotton, because most of the planters were taking their cotton to Mobile to sell, combining business with pleasure. Oh, it was such a happy scene. There were flags flying and music playing and skyrockets going off as the evening got colder and darker, because it did get colder and darker, something they had not planned on, though they knew when they left Columbus that it would not be an easy trip. It had rained for many days and the river was out of its banks, and that bothered the pilot, Daniel Epps. And he spoke to the captain, Captain Stone, about it, saying, I hope we're not overloading. It's going to be a treacherous trip because many of my landmarks are covered. And the captain said, oh, we're not overloading. Everything's going to be all right. And already the band was beginning to play in the ballroom, and the dancers were there. Beautifully polished floors and mirrors all around the walls so that they could see themselves dancing around and around that beautiful ballroom. Along midnight, just at the height of the festivities, somehow bales of cotton on the Eliza Battle caught fire. No one is sure now how it happened. The pilot spotted it and called the captain's attention to it, and the captain went into the ballroom to alert the passengers, and he didn't want to alarm them, but when he said, even in a calm voice, there's a small fire on board, there was instant pandemonium. And people ran out of the ballroom and ran toward the edge of the boat, and some of them jumped into the cold water. It was bitterly cold by then. Sleet was falling, little spittings of snow. They jumped into the water, and those who could swim tried to make it to shore. Others threw bales of cotton into the water and tried to use them as life rafts. But they tipped over, most of them. The Eliza Battle, blazing from stem to stern, drifted crazily away. Darkness closed in behind that boat. All you could hear was screams for help and occasionally a splash as someone fell from one of the trees into the river and drowned. And by daylight, residents along the river came to see what they could do to help. They were helpless in the dark. Of course, they couldn't see anything, but by daylight, they came with their skiffs and their small boats and rescued the passengers who were still clinging to the trees or who had made it to the banks, freezing cold. And owners of the plantations had their servants build makeshift rafts and put them out into the river to search for the bodies of those who were dead. And the survivors, 60, 70, 80, nobody knows exactly how many, they were taken to the home of Mrs. Pettigrew. She had a large house, and she apparently had a big heart and plenty of food there, because she took care of them until their family members could come from Columbus or Mobile or other points along the river take them home. She had big cauldrons of soup boiling all around the yard there and fed them the hot soup and gave them blankets to wrap in and clothing to replace their wet garments. It was a terrible tragedy, the greatest riverboat tragedy in the history of Alabama. Looking at this calm, peaceful river today, you wonder that such a thing could happen. You can almost hear the servants on the Pettigrew plantation as they worked building the rafts, and later as they made coffins for the dead. Hear them saying, "I always knew something bad was going to happen here," because you know what that river's name? Tombigbee. It's Indian for coffin makers. And now we're making the coffins for all those people who perished in the river. And even today, people who see a bright light moving down the river, who hear dancing tunes being played, say to themselves, "It's the Eliza battle. It's the ghost of the Eliza battle, warning us to leave the river. Some tragedy is going to take place." And they hurry away because they have been warned by the ghost of the Eliza battle. For more than 150 years, Gaineswood in Demopolis, Alabama, has been one of the show places of the state. A magnificent home built by General Whitfield, began construction in the 1840s. Took him 18 years to complete. He was not an architect, but he drew the plans for this building in great detail. He had an amazing sense of beauty and proportion and planned each room perfectly. It's hard to believe that when he began building, he brought his family and they lived in a log cabin here, been occupied by the Indian factor, Mr. Gaines. And so his friend named the great house that he was building Gaineswood. He did each bit slowly and carefully and perfectly, with great attention to detail. He was not only a good architect and a fine craftsman, he was a musician and an artist and a historian. He was truly a Renaissance man. And after the family had moved into this house, had several children, his wife became very ill and died, leaving him with small children. And he knew he needed a housekeeper, some woman to come and be the governor and housekeeper here to help take care of the children. And he employed a Miss Carter, I think that was her name. And she came down to live in Gaineswood and take care of the children. This was a lonely place then. It was out from town, and Demopolis itself didn't amount to much in those days. And she was lonesome. And so the general, being a very kind and thoughtful man, said, "Well, we will send for your sister to come down and visit for a while." The sister lived in Virginia. So they sent for the sister, Evelyn, to come down, and she was a delightful addition to the household. Evelyn told stories to the children and played games with them, and best of all, perhaps, she played this piano. She was an accomplished musician, and she sat at this bare keyboard and played, and the general played his violin, and at nights they'd all gather here and have a musical, and oh, it was fun. There was music and laughter. And then something tragic happened to Evelyn. The details are a little vague now. Some people say she had pneumonia. Others say that it was malaria that killed her. Others say it was a broken heart. There was a young Frenchman in Demopolis, one of those who had come over as part of Napoleon's former group of followers from France, started the vine and olive colony here. Handsome young Frenchman who came often to Gaineswood to see Evelyn. And he wanted to marry her. And on one occasion he brought a ring, and she was very happy about that. I think she must have loved him very much too. But they quarreled over that ring, the story goes. And the young Frenchman snatched the ring from her and threw it into the bushes and disappeared, and she never saw him again. And they say she died of a broken heart. Well, I'm not sure how she died, but she did die here in this house. And it was winter, an unusually bitter winter. There'd been many rains and then bitterly cold, and the roads were impassable, and her one wish was to be buried back home in Virginia. But there was no way to get her body back over those poor roads at that time. So General Whitfield sealed her body in a pine box and put it in the basement in a cellar underneath the stairs there, waiting until springtime came and the roads would be passable and he could send her body back to Virginia for burial. And he did do that. But, according to the story, Evelyn resented and hated being shut up in that pine box down in the basement. Her spirit was restless and unhappy. And she began to roam these rooms, these magnificent rooms. And even after her burial was completed in Virginia, they say, members of the family and guests here would be awakened at night by this very piano, playing the old tunes that Evelyn used to sit here and play, the unquiet ghost in Gainesville.